Good afternoon. My name is Melissa McCullum, and this year I had the privilege of doing my senior practicum presentation and my research project on the issues with Latin American immigration. So why did I choose this topic? As most of you know, I lived in Bogota, Colombia, South America for 5 years. In the middle of my first grade year, my parents started considering moving to South America or being missionaries somewhere in the world, and that's where we ended up deciding, and I lived there from 2nd to 6th grade. As most of us have already experienced those years, they're very formative in our lives. So a lot of who I am as a person and how I think was heavily influenced by my time living and being raised in Colombia. Because of that, and because of the people I know who have tried to become citizens or who have tried to immigrate or have family and friends who have done those same things, South American immigration has almost always been on my mind. With the current political climate surrounding immigration and how much it has drastically changed in the last couple of years, my interest in South American immigration was again piqued. And being the political and legal nerd that I am, I've done a lot of research even before I knew this was my topic. Originally, I wanted to do an assessment of the entire immigration system, and I quickly realized that that was very unrealistic when I checked out a book from the library that was about this size, but it was about 3 inches thick, and it was called Immigration Made Easy. So if that was the simple version, that was going to be impossible. So I decided that I needed to narrow down my topic, but I wasn't quite sure how, so I decided to read a book called Seeking Refuge as my summer reading book. And while I was reading that, I ran across a quote, and it was actually the definition of a refugee according to the United Nations. The definition says, "A refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group." When I first read this, I thought it seemed oddly specific and slightly exclusive. From the first time I read it, I could think of multiple things that wouldn't fit into one of these 5 groups, and that worried me because I know people who fit into those groups but wouldn't be able to be considered a refugee if this definition was really as strict as I thought it was. So I began to do a little bit of research, and at the very beginning, I thought that the particular social group seemed sort of like an other or all-inclusive option. So anybody who doesn't fit into the fear of persecution for race, religion, nationality, or political opinion can be considered a particular social group. But I soon realized that that wasn't true. First, I ran across a report on South American immigration into the United States that worried me and helped me to understand that there were some people being left out of this definition. The quote says, "Fewer than 50 South American nationals, all from Colombia, arrived in the United States as refugees in the entire year of 2011. Accounting for a negligible percentage of the 56,384 refugees admitted overall. Historically, relatively few South Americans have ever entered as refugees. Between 2002 and 2011, a total of 1,569 South Americans have entered as refugees, accounting for less than 0.5% of the 515,350 persons who entered the United States as refugees." At that point, I realized, yes, this is an issue. Specifically what is happening in our immigration system, that people who have such well-founded fears of persecution, as Latin Americans do, aren't even presented with the opportunity to immigrate with help or offered any help in any accessible way to them. So, as most of you know, our Practicum research project is split into 2 semesters. The fall semester, we spend a lot of time understanding the basic and doing basic research about our topic, and then studying the root cause of the problem, and we complete our first site visit during that semester as well, which I did as attending a conference in DC on immigration and advocacy, which was run by the Justice Conference. In the spring semester, we study the solution, and we begin to respond by completing our second site visit, which I did as an interview with an expert on immigration, Miss Jennifer Vargas, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and then we complete our service project, which I did through Christian Legal Aid of DC, which I'll also talk about a little bit later. Now, before I get too far down the road, I would like to define a couple terms so that we have a similar understanding as I go into the rest of my presentation. Currently, as up to this point in my presentation, you've already heard me say Central America, South America, and Latin America, so I want to clarify what each one of those is. Central America is the space from Mexico down to the border of Colombia. So what we call Central America is basically from the end of the United States to the beginning of Colombia. South America is from Colombia all the way down to the southern tip of that continent. But Latin America is a term used to encompass both of them. So a lot of research that I found was actually done on Latin America and not just South America. So my original thought was to study South American immigration, but I realized that was kind of hard because rarely do people separate Central and South America. So most is done on Latin America. So I will use those terms interchangeably, but Latin America encompasses a bit more, but most of the issues in South America are actually universal through all of Latin America. So the majority of our first semester is a research project. The first question we ask ourselves in this practicum process is, why is this a problem? And the first thing that I ran across was some research, and it very quickly convinced me that there was something Latin Americans had to be running from. So according to the Washington Post, Latin America is home to just 8% of the world's population, but 33% of its homicides. In fact, just 4 countries in the region, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, account for a quarter of all the murders on Earth. Of the 20 countries in the world with the highest murder rates, 17 are Latin American. At that time, I realized, yes, this is an issue. Latin Americans have a very valid thing to be running from, and clearly something is going on in that part of the world if 8% of the population makes up for almost a third of the murders that are happening in the whole world. Through my second site visit, I began to realize that this is not only something that Latin Americans have to be running from, but that our immigration system isn't helping them like it ought to be. I interviewed Ms. Jennifer Vargas, and she explained to me a lot about the problem and a lot about the things that are implemented currently that aren't helping people in Latin America. So we talked a lot about the UNHCR and the United Nations and the United States definition of a refugee or an asylum seeker. So for example, out in the Middle East, if you are trying to become a refugee, you probably fit one of those 5 criteria in the definition very easily. Most persecution out there is happening because of race or gender or some of the other things on that list, so it takes almost no argument to get you qualified as a refugee. Once you're qualified, the UNHCR has set up offices all through the Middle East that provide help with people who are seeking refugee status and seeking to pursue that and eventually come to the United States or to another country as well. Those offices are an amazing part of our immigration system that is set up to be a help to people who can't go through the entire immigration process because they need to get out quick and they need help. There's also an asylum process, which happens more at our borders, that functions sort of the same way to help people who can't wait for the immigration process and they need to get out. But something that we also talked a lot about with Ms. Vargas is that in Latin America, not a single one of those UNHCR offices exists. So not only do people probably not fit the definition of a refugee if they're coming from Latin America, they're not offered any help. The definition of a refugee that I read you earlier is also used in the United States as the definition for an asylum seeker. The idea of an asylum seeker is basically if you don't qualify as a refugee, you'll probably be an asylum seeker. If you don't qualify as an asylum seeker, you're probably a refugee. But in our country, that doesn't happen at all because we use the exact same definition. And most Latin Americans are running from things that don't fit into one of those 4 obvious persecutions, and it's really hard for them to form particular social groups. So they don't even have the option to be a refugee, let alone do they get any help. So at that point, I realized this isn't just an issue in Latin America that people have something to run from, but it's an issue in our country that we're not helping them, and we're not giving them any help, or even letting them be defined as somebody who might need help. The second question we ask ourselves at this point in the practicum process is, how does this problem distort God's creation, and what did God intend for this part of creation? Many places throughout the Bible, God tells us to love our neighbors and help the poor and the widows and the orphans and the foreigners, and this is a verse that I ran across that really proved that point. Leviticus 19:34 says, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." This isn't saying that there's no place for borders or immigration laws or anything of that sort, but rather that we should be making those laws and policies in seeking to help the foreigner and not to hurt them, or to send them back to a place where their lives are at stake when we have ample resources and opportunities to help them. So the third question we ask ourselves is, what is the root cause of this issue? Through my research, I found that the deepest cause of the immigration issues in our country is our tendency to see others as less human than ourselves. That's dehumanizing. Since we are so far removed from immigrants and we can't quite conceive of them as just as human as the person who's sitting next to us, we dehumanize them and we detach ourselves from any sense of their humanity. Since our lawmakers and our government officials are thinking like that as well, they don't perceive these immigrants as humans, so they don't perceive them as deserving of the same rights and liberties as we are. Because of this kind of thinking, all sorts of mistreatment and problems and loopholes happen in our system and our policies because we don't even think they're humans, so why do they deserve our help? And that's how the dehumanizing affects our immigration system. Through this research, I also found a secondary and a tertiary root cause that are very much connected to the dehumanizing that we do. The secondary one is our, as Americans, but also as human beings, our choice to disregard other people's humanity. If we aren't subconsciously dehumanizing people already, sometimes we choose to disregard their humanity because of the tertiary root cause, our selfishness. We don't want them, who we already don't think of as humans, so why does it matter if we clump them into a whole group? We don't think of them as deserving of anything, and we think that they're just gonna come take our jobs, our money, and threaten our safety, and that's what's most important. So why should we offer them any help, and why should we rework our system and do so much work to help somebody who it doesn't really even matter, or they're a threat to us as well? So I want to show you this quick video by the Evangelical Immigration Table that sort of echoes what I've already said and talks a little bit about what we ought to do as Christians and just as human beings in general in response to this problem.
Immigration is such a hot topic these days, and for many Christians, we wrestle with what is it that is the best for not only our country, but what does God seek and want? Genesis 1, it is very clear that God said that He created everyone in His own image.
Christians can disagree about what immigration policy ought to be. What we can't disagree about is the dignity of immigrants themselves.
We should recognize that every single person, citizen and immigrant, documented and non-documented, every single person is created in the image of God.
And as His creatures, He treats us with dignity and with respect. And that's what He wants us to do in our treatment of others, including immigrants, so that the words we speak and the attitudes that we have toward immigrants and others are the same as the words and the attitudes of God.
The United States has long welcomed people from around the world who are fleeing dangerous situations, including religious persecution. And our faith calls on us to care for those who are most vulnerable.
So that video echoes a lot of what I've said, but kind of leans nicely into the next portion of our practicum process, which is the response. We do this in a 3-step process where we complete 2 site visits and then a service project to try and discover a solution and then to begin implementing that as best we can. So my first site visit I did with the Justice Conference by attending a conference in DC by the Justice Institute on Immigration and Advocacy through the Justice Conference. They organize and run conferences all over the country about all sorts of hot political and Christian and all sorts of different topics, and they try to educate Christians and just people in general on how they ought to respond to these issues. The conference that I attended was specifically on immigration and advocacy because it was in DC, and they surrounded the conference on this verse, Proverbs 31:8-9, that says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy." We spent the first day talking about immigration issues, trying to understand it because obviously none of us were experts on immigration, but we were spoken to by experts about different issues that were currently facing the country. And then the second day, they took the conference goers up to Capitol Hill and allowed them the opportunity to speak to their senators and their representatives and to advocate for different immigration issues. I was only able to attend the first day, but I learned a lot at this point in the process just about how immigration works and a lot more about how a Christian should respond as well. We spent a lot of the morning talking about just the basic functions of our system. It's quite complex, and as that thick book I checked out kind of showed me, there's a lot to it and a lot of different paths you can take. So we talked a lot about that, and it was really helpful to my practicum process in general. We spent a really long time talking about DACA and Dreamers, which, if you remember, was a huge problem and hot topic in the summer of 2018, as the Trump administration had just ended those programs in 2017, so there was a lot of pushback on that. And we talked a lot about it because the media and everybody in general was showing and was portraying the DACA and Dreamers program as something that we just let people in illegally. Once we find out they're illegal, we give them free citizenship, and that's how that works. But we talked about that for a really long time because that's not how it works. The program actually offers work visas to people who are brought into this country against their will. So people who had no option, whether it was children or some other situation, who are brought in against their will. It offers them work visas and then offers them the opportunity to work up to citizenship. So they're not just handed citizenship and told it's okay, you came in illegally. So we talked a lot about that to try and just gain a better understanding about how the process actually works. And I began to understand that this is one of those processes that we had in place that is beginning to fill holes in our immigration system, just like the hole that I'm researching. We spent a lot of time talking about the humanitarian relief that was already happening for refugees, and it actually convinced me not to do my research on refugees, but rather to do my research on who's being left out of this refugee program, because we do already have such a great program in place. We talked quite a bit about family-based immigration and family separation, which was also a very hot topic during the summer of 2018. And we talked a lot about the net impact of immigrants on our economy and on our country in general. If you have any questions about those things, I would love to answer those later, but it's not really the main focus of my topic, so I won't talk too much about it. But we spent a lot of the afternoon talking about asylum versus refugees, which is very pertinent to my topic. We talked about how there's no way for Latin Americans to be considered refugees until they reach the border, and even then, most of them don't qualify, because most of them are running from things like domestic violence and gang violence, which don't fit into that category, those categories that I read you earlier. I've completed my second site visit by interviewing Ms. Jennifer Vargas, who was, recommended to me by Mr. Robert Rose, who I eventually did my service project with. She's currently practicing immigration law with Roth Jackson in Virginia, and I was able to interview her over the phone and spent almost an hour speaking with her, and it was a wonderful time, and I got lots of information. She studied immigration and nationality law in law school, and she currently practices immigration and nationality law, and she does a lot of things with family-based immigration and American spouses, getting spouse visas, getting those turned into green cards turned into citizenship, so she knows a lot about the process. But she also does a lot of work with deportation events, asylum law, and criminal immigrants, which are very difficult topics to deal with, so she knows exactly what she's talking about, and she's actually published in a lot of law journals as well, so she's very well informed. We spent most of our time talking about how asylum seekers have to fit the same definition as a refugee, and how that doesn't work for Latin Americans. So just as a reminder, the 5 categories of persecution in that definition are race, religion, nationality, or political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. We talked about how this 5th option, membership of a particular social group, is created with the intent to say that as long as you form some sort of social group and it can sort of be specified, you have a viable claim for asylum. And as long as you have proof of persecution of some sort, why shouldn't you be given the help that you need? She explained to me that a lot of Latin Americans are running from domestic violence. A lot of women and children, but also a lot of men as well, running from issues of domestic violence in the home of some sort, but how domestic violence isn't recognized as one of these 5 categories. Some circuit courts have begun to qualify domestic violence as good enough to fit a particular social group, but they say that the issue is it isn't unique enough. So a lot of courts aren't, and that's a huge issue because these women and children are running from very real threats and they have no opportunities for help. To kind of further explain what they mean by domestic violence isn't unique enough, here's another example. Gang violence is very pervasive in Latin America. Not necessarily gang violence as in I joined a gang and now I'm being attacked by another gang, but a lot of people who are living in towns growing up there, boys who reach the age of 12, where their moms, their sisters, their lives are being threatened if they don't join a gang. So people who don't necessarily want to be involved in the gang life at all, who are being persecuted and their lives being threatened, and they need to get away from that. But their particular social group would be males from the ages of 12 to 20. There's no other way to define it because that would be too constraining and you would leave a lot of people out. So males from 12 to 20 tend to be that particular social group, but that's not unique enough because if the definition is any male from 12 to 20, then we would be letting in a lot of random people into our country. So that's not unique enough, and that's kind of the same way it works with domestic violence, is that there's no way to make a unique enough group so nobody in either of those 2 pools gets to qualify as a refugee or as an asylum seeker, and so they don't get the help that they need. Along with that, there are some issues with the system as well because 1 to 2 threats of persecution is not enough to get you qualified. You have to have some proof of past or present or a fear of future persecution, and your proof has to be good enough proof for the courts to accept you, and oftentimes that takes the death of somebody, and once somebody's died, it might be too late for you to get away. So we talked about those 2 things a lot because those are very pertinent with Latin American immigration. She deals a lot with applications for asylum from Latin America, so she knows a lot about how most of them qualify as domestic violence or gang violence, people who are running away from those things, but they don't qualify because those aren't considered in this definition. So one thing that she said to me, which I had been thinking through the whole process and it was very nice to get affirmed, was that it's actually harder to get in from Latin America than it is from the Middle East. So I asked her what she thought might be a solution or some way that we can reconcile the situation. And what she said to me is that the political and legal side of immigration need to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. And this is what I sort of took to be my solution for my problem. The political and judicial branches and every part of our government needs to work on it by a case-by-case basis because it's not as easy as adding domestic violence into that category. because oftentimes domestic violence is something that you can escape within your own country by getting out of a town or an area. Sometimes people have to leave the country, especially if it's like drug related or their husbands are in the drug cartel. That can cause a lot of issues. So getting them out of their country is necessary, but it's not so necessary that we need to insert that into our definition of a refugee. In the same way, it's almost impossible to insert anything into our definition of a refugee at this point because that definition happens on a worldwide level with the UN. So it's not so easy. So what needs to happen is that people need to work with it on a case-by-case basis. And something that was really encouraging to me that she said is that that's already happening. Lawyers are working on a case-by-case basis, and that's why some people are qualifying as refugees or asylum seekers for domestic violence because the lawyers are fighting for it. So for my service project, I realized that I had no legal training and I had no obvious way that I could help these immigrants because I can't go into court and fight for them. So I decided that I would help the people who help people to try and move towards a solution. So I decided to volunteer for Christian Legal Aid, and on Tuesday, March 26th and March 27th, I served with Mr. Robert Rose and Ms. Deborah Smith through Christian Legal Aid of DC. Christian Legal Aid is an organization that serves immigrants, homeless people, and the poor community of the District of Columbia area through providing free or reduced legal aid, advice, or representation. I worked specifically with Mr. Robert Rose, the executive director of this organization. I was able to help Mr. Robert Rose and Ms. Smith in their office, which is actually connected to a church and in a little house. And I was able to go through boxes and boxes of files to get rid of files that were old and to do the tasks that they didn't need taking up their time so they could do the substantive legal work. I listened to messages and transcribed them for Ms. Smith for a while and heard some very interesting stories through that. So I just did some menial tasks. And then in the afternoon, Mr. Rose asked me to read some reports, depositions, claims, and transcripts that he had on a case that they were working on, and he asked me to summarize it for him, annotate it, and do some research on it for him so that once he could get to the case, he could move through it quickly. Now, mind you, this is work that's normally done by a paralegal and somebody with some sort of qualification, so I was very unqualified. But Mr. Rose had the utmost confidence in me, and being the legal nerd that I am, I had so much fun. So then the second day, I met Mr. Rose at a homeless shelter in DC called Central Union Mission, where he was working out of the Christian Legal Aid's office there. While he's there, he serves there once a week. He's available to meet with anyone living in the building or in the community who has an ongoing case, needs legal advice, or has to continue doing some paperwork or any other legal help that they need. He's there to offer it. So while I was there, I spent my morning doing some more paralegal work by writing a motion to seal criminal records for a woman who was Mr. Rose's client, whose case I had actually worked on the day before as well. I was writing that motion involved quite a bit of research and quite a bit of trust in me on Mr. Rose's side. And in the afternoon, we had a phone meeting with the lady to be able to get more information to add into the motion, and then I sent it to Mr. Rose, and he looked at it once and then sent it into the court system. So that was pretty awesome. I spent the afternoon going through more files and then sitting in on meetings that Mr. Rose was having with clients and being able to just learn more, partially because I'm a legal nerd, but also to help me learn some more about my practicum process in general. So what did I learn from this process in general? I learned that the actual process of immigration is amazingly complicated, but I also began to get a grip on how it works through just a year of study. I learned that immigration process can be quite simple if you speak English, know what path to follow, and you aren't a criminal. So for a lot of immigrants, that's really hard, and they need legal advice and counsel for this process, and that's why there's a need for immigration attorneys to be working not just in the United States, but all over the country. I learned while I was trying to find a place to do my service project that it's really hard to communicate with organizations because they're busy and they're doing a lot of things. I ran into a lot of issues with busy organizations not getting back to me or me not getting back to them, and I realized that it's very hard sometimes to work with organizations outside of your school or your immediate community. I also learned, specifically through my service project, I learned that there are a lot of really hardworking lawyers behind immigration who are working out the complexities of immigration by fighting for people in court on a case-by-case basis. Through that, I also learned that not everything immigration related has to happen in court. There's a lot of stuff that can happen with a simple meeting, a simple phone call, a lot of paperwork turning to the right organization, and a lot of good work can be done through that. So even the paralegals are doing a lot of great work for immigration policy in general. My worldview was actually challenged quite a bit. It made me more empathetic for people who fear immigrants, but it also made me more empathetic for immigrants as well. I began to understand the lies that we tell ourselves and the lies that we are told by the media and etc. that make people fear immigrants, but I also began to understand the facts behind immigration and why we shouldn't fear immigrants, but rather how we should help them and how we can break down those barriers so that we can protect people who need our help. My worldview was also very reaffirmed through my meeting specifically with Ms. Vargas and how much she reiterated a lot of the things that I had been researching and I had been thinking through the whole process. So what are my future plans with what I've learned? I immediately plan to go back to Christian Legal Aid of DC and work with them a little bit over the summer. They invited me back, so I'm hoping to find a couple days this summer where I can go back and help them keep sorting files and eating lunch with the people and having wonderful conversations with them. Obviously, in the bit further future, I plan to attend Wheaton College and study political science and to minor in Spanish and pre-law, and eventually attend law school in DC. I hope to study immigration law or to be a federal prosecutor or a state prosecutor, and to do, hopefully, pro bono work for an organization like Christian Legal Aid someday. So yeah, I do have my whole future planned out. So in conclusion, what can you do? If you don't believe me that Latin Americans have something to run from, I would encourage you to check out this website. They have a lot of statistics and information about homicides happening all over the world and other situations. And as you can see from the graphic there, a lot of Latin America is orange or red, which means that there's a lot of homicides happening there, and almost none of the country has that much deep red colors in any continent. So I would encourage you to check that out and just look at some of the more of the statistics and do a little bit more research on what they have to run from and why. If you're interested in volunteering, I would really encourage you to do that. There are a lot of organizations that need help because they have a very small staff, and a lot of their staff is taken up with doing menial tasks like sorting files or cleaning or whatever it is. So if you're even remotely interested, I would encourage you to volunteer with an organization like Christian Legal Aid of DC or World Relief, who I could also get you in contact with if you wanted to talk to them. But I encourage you on a more basic level, on a more day-to-day level, to begin to rehumanize everybody you see. Whether that's the criminal on the news, the person with the locker next to you, or the immigrants you read about in the news, remember that they're human, and by consciously remembering that, it'll help you to view situations very differently, and it can change things on a much wider scale with a lot of different issues in our country more than just immigration. So before I finish, I'd like to give a couple thank yous to people who are very helpful to me. I would like to thank Mr. Rose and Ms. Smith for allowing me to intrude for 2 days on their work, and for teaching me so much and taking me out to lunch and telling me so much about their life stories, how they ended up in Christian Legal Aid, and all of the wonderful work that they're doing with Christian Legal Aid of DC. I would like to thank Ms. Jennifer Vargas for taking time to talk to me, being so encouraging and giving me so much information and encouraging me to keep pursuing this in my future. I want to thank Mr. Swanson and Mr. Sharon for being my Practicum teachers these last 2 semesters, for giving me so much grace through all of the craziness that happened in those 2 semesters, and for really encouraging me in this process as well. But I'd also like to thank my mom and my dad for encouraging me and putting up with me randomly reading them statistics and ranting to them because I would get super into my topic, and then also being very helpful and getting me to all of my site visits and my service project, but also encouraging me every day since I was little to pursue the things that I love and I'm interested in. Now I would like to take any questions that you guys have.
Yes, sir. So, like I said in the beginning, this is a tough topic that you tackled here.
Yeah.
Kudos to you for doing it. So, I'm sure that you've had discussions with people who don't agree with where you landed. How do you respond to that? Also recognizing that they too are made in the image of God, even though what they said might just sound really ignorant and frustrating to you.
Yeah, I found that a lot of people at first were pushing back a lot. They're like, I disagree with that. And they were like, you just want to let in all the illegals and give them whatever they want. And I was like, that's not at all what I'm saying. So I found that a little bit into our conversation, we realized that we agree more than we thought we did. That people often think, no, we need to stop letting people come in and do all these things because they don't really understand what's happening on the other side. Mm-hmm. So people don't realize that part of the reason we have so many illegal immigrants is because our system is failing. So once I kind of explained to them, like, this is what's happening in our system, this is why people aren't qualifying and getting the help that we're offering them, they were like, oh, okay, I understand. So I think after a little bit of a conversation, we actually understood a lot more. And there were still people who still had some pushback. But I think just by being like, okay, before we get too political over this, too partisan or whatever, let's talk about what's actually happening in our system. And obviously I've done a little bit more research than most people just because it was my practicum. So being able to present that to them and being like, here, I did this research. Do you want to look at it with me? And we can like discuss this before we discuss the like very polarized views that people have. Right? Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. Well, actually, I have a comment that will morph into a question.
Okay.
So, the comment is, one, just thank you for choosing this topic. One of my dearest friends is the daughter of immigrants from Venezuela. And I just think about her family that is still in Venezuela and just the dire situation there, and how they're stuck in kind of this limbo state of not being able to come to the States where they have family and people who are vouching for them, and it's just not working. So thank you for choosing this topic. But then from that, I liked what you were saying about fear, and as I was thinking about my friend, I realized that I also have another friend, one of my dearest friends from high school, who was also the daughter of an immigrant, but I forget it because her family is from Australia,
Yeah.
where no one is really saying, let's stop the Australians from coming to the States.
Yeah.
So where do you think that fear comes from, where there are just these places that people assume that if you're coming from there, you're just bringing whatever's happening in that nation into this nation? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that even make
Yes.
sense? Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of it happens because of what we're told about those countries. So a lot of Latin American countries have very corrupt governments, and we hear that a lot about that in our news, and we hear it all over the place, and like, oh, this is happening, these people are killing these people, these gangs are overrunning this. And because we've dehumanized those people and we've disconnected ourselves so much from people outside of the United States, we think of them as a country and not as a person. So we think like, oh, all those Colombians are selling cocaine. Like, I've heard that a million times. But no, that's not true. There's a very small portion that do, and there are millions of wonderful, well, thousands, I guess, of wonderful people in Colombia. And so when we characterize people by just the country they're from and the things we hear about their country, we forget that they're human, and we forget to separate them from them. But then when people say stuff like that about us, we get offended. They're like, oh, all Americans are fat. And we're like, no, we're not. And like, we get offended, but we don't realize that we do the same things. So I think it stems from that dehumanizing as well, but also just clumping people because we haven't actually gotten to know them, which kind of relates to Jamie's practicum as well. Any more questions?
Can I ask one more
Yeah.
before I can finish? So as, I think, particularly for me, I'm going to ask as a Spanish teacher, how can I do better in helping people see the reality of this?
Yeah, I think that's hard because especially in high school, I think a lot of people have come in with preconceptions already, and they already know what they think, or they think they know what they think. So I think on a very practical level, just getting to know people, even in your own classroom. Like, we had some like fully Spanish people, like Angie, completely Hispanic, and just realizing like, oh, she's Hispanic and she's not a drug dealer. Like, oh wow, that's interesting. So I think getting to know people is very helpful, and obviously that's hard because we don't live in a super Hispanic populated area, but just people in general, and understanding that, helping kids to understand that they're more than just a country, like they're individual people and they're living their lives, doing things, I think is maybe the most practical. But I also think if people in our country are more educated on the immigration system in general, they would have a better understanding of the issues, which is kind of hard to teach people. I don't even understand what it is entirely, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question. You talked about the whole thing is just super complicated,
Yeah.
which is I think one of the main arguments you were making. And I think one of the tensions I'm thinking through is, okay, so one of the solutions is to understand better and to know who these people are, be able to understand their identity as human beings. But ultimately, if the problem is people are unsafe where they are and don't have a way to become safe, right? You said the definition is from the UN and it's not going to change. So what do we do? Is it more likely that we can change the UN's definition of a refugee, or is it more likely that we can end violence in South America? Or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because other than that,
Great
like,
question.
what do we do?
I think I would say both, because I think changing the UN's definition, or even just because the US adopted the UN's definition and that's why we use it. So even on our country level, we could change it before we change the UN's definition. So I think working that is very helpful, but that takes a long time. Like, obviously, I'm not in the Senate yet or anything like that, so I can't actually change those things yet. But so working towards those things, and I think there are a lot of people in our country who are working towards those things. But also, serving in other countries. Like we served as missionaries, and I met a lot of missionaries who were doing great work to help the situation. Like the Civil War in Colombia is practically over because of not just missionaries, but just the work that's happening there. But what makes it also really difficult is that they're a very corrupt government. So it's not like the US can go in and say, here, we have this program to help your people do this, because it might not happen, or it might get twisted or something like that. So I think there is help we can offer, but I also don't, it's not necessarily always our place to go in and say, here, fix your country. But then also, how do we do that without hurting people? So I think both of those helps a lot, but they're also both very complicated. Yeah. Anything else?
I think you are done.
Thank you.
Great job.